And so, Professor Olen's voice filled the amphitheater, a low, carefully modulated hum that caused the acoustic panels on the walls to resonate faintly. We observe a Class 9 geotectonic event, a catastrophic lithospheric rupture resulting in violent explosion of silicate melt and superheated gases. It is, for all intents and purposes, a planetary exsanguination, a world bleeding its own molten heart into the cosmos. Before him, a massive, hyper-realistic hologram materialized in the center of the room. It depicted pure, cosmic violence. A mountain peak, once capped with ice, disintegrated upwards in a silent, horrifying ballet of force. A column of black smoke and incandescent rock climbed for miles into a bruised purple sky. Lightning, born from the friction of 1 billion tons of pulverized stone, webbed through the roiling cloud. The image was beautiful and terrifying, a monument to the untamable energies of the universe. The entire class of 30 Lanthian students, slender, long-limbed beings whose pale gray skin was patterned with faint, darker striations unique to each individual, collectively drew a sharp, whistling breath. It was the sound of horrified awe, the gasp of a species that had long ago engineered chaos out of their existence, and now viewed it as a caged beast in a zoo. From the back row, a loud, dismissive laugh cut through the reverent hush. The sound was a file grating on spun glass. The noise so alien, so utterly out of place in this temple of academic dread, that every head took a moment to pivot. Kai Jordan, the sole human of the Interspecies Galactic University's Xenealogy program, slouched back so far in his seat he was nearly horizontal. His worn synth leather boots rested on the polished chrome of the desk before him. He worked a piece of gum from one side of his mouth to the other, the motion slow and deliberate. "That's just a volcano," he said. The universal translator in his ear rendered the casual observation into the fluid, tonal Lanthian language with a flat, robotic tone. The human's translator was a standard-issue military model, prized for its accuracy with technical jargon, but notorious for its literal, often brutal interpretation of colloquialisms. A new quiet descended. It was heavier and colder than the previous one. Every single Lanthian, from the students in their neatly pressed academic robes to the professor who floated an inch off the floor on his personal grav plate, turned to stare at the barbarian in the back. Their large eyes, which lacked pupils and reflected the room's light with a deep, liquid quality, fixed on him. Badru, a student who sat perpetually in the front row as if to absorb knowledge through proximity, grew rigid. His limbs, already long, seemed to lengthen with sheer offense. The faint gray patterns on his skin darkening in a physiological response to agitation.
"That is a Class 9 geotectonic event, human,"
he chirped, his voice sharp and clipped.
"A planetary exsanguination. Textbook of Cataclysmic Geology, Volume 3, page 412.
Professor Olen, whose academic dignity had suffered a grievous wound, narrowed his large, dark eyes, which seemed to drink the light of the hollow projector. His robes, which normally billowed with an air of effortless authority, settled and stiffened around his frame. "Mr. Jordan," he intoned, his voice growing quiet, each word layered with frost. "Do you have something to add? Perhaps you find planetary-scale cataclysms amusing?" Kai swung his feet off the desk. The thud of his boots echoed in the hall. The chair's legs slammed back into the floor with a crack. He sat up, a lazy smirk on his lips, and the Lanthians collectively recoiled at the sudden, aggressive motion. "Amusing? No, just normal." He stood and stretched, a series of pops and cracks from his spine that made several students wince.
He ambled toward the tiered steps toward the hologram, suddenly energized, a predator that had been feigning sleep. Look, your simulation's great, very metal. Really captures the whole skies on fire vibe. But you're missing the point. It's not some cosmic horror, it's just plumbing. Bad plumbing. He reached the front, and with a casual wave interfaced with the holographic controls. The dramatic eruption froze. Kai swiped his hand, and the image dissolved. A cutaway diagram of Earth's crust replaced it. Magma chamber, he said. He tapped a vast, glowing red reservoir deep beneath the surface. Think of it like a soda can that someone shook for 1,000 years. The magma has dissolved gases in it, like a carbonated drink. As it rises, the pressure drops. He gestured upward along a thin conduit. The gas comes out of a solution and it makes bubbles. Lots and lots of bubbles. Suddenly your thick liquid turns into a violent, expanding foam. And that foam needs somewhere to go. He swiped again and brought back the exploding mountain. So it goes up. Violently. He turned to face the class. A passion they had never seen in him lit his eyes. This isn't a mythical beast. It's a machine. It's a terrifyingly powerful, world-building, life-ending machine. But it's still a machine. We know how it works. We live on the factory floor. He launched into an impromptu, electrifying lecture that left Professor Olin's dramatic prose in the dust. He spoke of subduction zones where oceanic plates dove under continents, melting rock and feeding on the chambers below. He explained tectonic plates, describing them as massive rafts of rock that floated on a sea of molten mantle. They ground against each other, built up stress for centuries, and then released it in a world-shaking snap. He dropped facts like grenades into the silent classroom. The lava that comes out of some of these things can hit 1,200 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than the forges of most of your homeworlds. Your ships would melt. Sound of Krakatoa's eruption in 1883 was the loudest sound in recorded history. It ruptured the eardrums of sailors 40 miles away. The boom was heard 3,000 miles away, and the shockwave circled the globe 4 times. He conjured a new hologram, a map of ancient Italy. This place, Pompeii, got buried in ash and pumice so fast that we found bread still in the ovens. People were flash-cooked and then encased. They left perfect voids in the ash where their bodies lay. We poured plaster in the holes and we made statues of their last moments of panic. A wave of nausea rippled through the Lanthian students. The patterns on Badru's skin had turned to sickly, mottled gray. Kai wasn't finished. He zoomed out and he showed a map of North America. A vast, angry red blotch covered the states of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. And this big boy, he said, gesturing with a grin far too wide for the subject matter, is Yellowstone. That's a supervolcano. The magma chamber underneath it is so huge it could swallow a small moon, if it decides to, and I quote, he paused for dramatic effect, have a planetary self-decapitation event. The translator, grappling with the idiom, blew its top dutifully and horrifyingly spat out the literal interpretation. It's pretty much a continental game over. The initial blast would vaporize everything for 400 miles. The ash would bury half the continent, collapse buildings, poison water supplies, and the sulfur dioxide that it would pump into the atmosphere would block out the sun. That would plunge the whole planet into a volcanic winter that could last for decades. No crops, mass starvation, the end of civilization as we know it. He clapped his hands together. The sharp sound made everyone jump. Fun stuff, right? We learn about it in grade school. The Lanthian students were catatonic. Their faces were a perfect mosaic of abject terror and morbid fascination. A few of them even held their breath, their thin chests still. They stared at Kai as a creature who could casually discuss the literal end of his world and then chew his gum. It was a biological paradox, a sentient being who flourished in an environment that should have rendered consciousness a brief, terrified anomaly. Professor Oland was aghast. His entire carefully crafted lesson on cosmic terror, the centerpiece of his Xenogeology 301 curriculum, was hijacked and turned into a Death Worlder's casual recounting of near-extinction events. He felt his authority, his very purpose, dissolve in the face of this human's cheerful nihilism. Badru, ever the loyalist, shot to his feet. His slender body was rigid with outrage.
Professor, this is a baseless sensationalism. The human is clearly exaggerating for effect. Furthermore, the Galactic University Charter for Interspecies Excursions, Section 4, Paragraph 2, strictly forbids unsanctioned travel to any planet with a Class 7 hazard rating or higher. Earth is a Class 7. It is a prohibited zone for a reason.
Olen held up a slender, three-fingered hand and silenced his protege. The initial shock faded and was replaced by a cold academic fury. A hard light entered his dark eyes. He saw opportunity. He could reassert his dominance, call the humans bluff, and expose this casual bravado as the coping mechanism of a doomed species. An excellent point, Badru, Olin said, his voice smooth as polished stone. Your knowledge of University Charter is, as always, impeccable. However, the Terrans, in their unique wisdom, have commercialized their own apocalypse. They established regulated academic excursion zones, complete with pre-approved liability waivers that this university, after extensive legal review, now accepts. He tapped a series of commands into the wrist-mounted data slate that hovered just above his skin. A soft chime echoed in the hall. As it happens, a Terran academic vessel, the TAS Carl Sagan, is already in system for a xenobotany survey. The vessel is fully certified for atmospheric entry and short-range transport. I have just requisitioned a transport shuttle for tomorrow morning. The class erupted in a flurry of panicked, whispered murmurs. The sounds of distress were like the chittering of frightened insects. Olen's gaze fixed on Kai. The board values experiential learning, after all. If Mr. Jordan insists these apocalyptic fire mountains are mere geology, then our class shall observe them firsthand. We will travel to this terror. We will see this mundane reality for ourselves. The murmurs intensified into quiet shrieks of terror. A few students looked as though they might faint. Kai just shrugged, a wide grin spreading across his face. Cool, he said. The word landed like a dropped stone in a silent pond. The gift shop at Vesuvius is pretty neat. Just don't buy the replica statues, they're kind of morbid. The Lanthian vessel, the Silent Contemplation, was designed for serene, silent gliding through vibrant nebula and the gentle rings of gas giants. The ship was utterly unprepared for a turbulent entry into the thick, soupy atmosphere of a high-gravity world. The ship shuddered and groaned, its frame protesting its rough treatment. For the Lanthians, the ordeal began long before they landed. The moment the shuttle detached and began its descent, the oppressive pull of a full 1G latching onto their weight, their slender frames. It was a physical assault. A constant, crushing weight that made their bones ache and their movements sluggish. They felt heavy, clumsy, trapped in bodies that seemed twice their normal mass. Breathing required conscious effort. Then the shuttle doors hissed open in Naples, and the world attacked their senses. The air was the first wave of the assault. It was thick, wet, and heavy. The humidity clung to their skin. A dampness their species, evolved in a dry, stable world, found deeply unsettling. The air was saturated with a million competing smells that made their sensitive olfactory glands burn. The salty brine of the sea, the rich aroma of baking bread and roasting garlic from a nearby cafe, The sharp, acrid bite of hydrocarbon exhaust from ground vehicles. The subtle, pervasive scent of decay and life all mixed into one chaotic perfume. The sunlight was the second wave. It was not the gentle, diffused light of their tide-locked home world, filtered through a thick, stable atmosphere. This was a harsh, blinding glare that grabbed and stabbed at their large, pupilless eyes. It reflected off of every surface, raw and unfiltered, and painted the world in colors too vibrant, too intense. They traveled by a chartered ground shuttle to the ruins of Pompeii. The vehicle lurched and swayed in a way that made several students feel nauseous. When they stepped out onto the ancient stone streets, Kai became an impromptu tour guide. His usual languid posture was replaced by an energetic enthusiasm. He seemed to draw strength from the chaotic environment that was draining his classmates.
This whole city was buried in about 18 hours,
he explained. He walked backward as he led the group.
First, a rain of light pumice, then heavier stuff. It gave most people time to get out, But the ones who stayed, though.
He led them past the forum, the amphitheater, and the ruined vias. The Lanthians looked around, their minds struggling to process the scene. It was a city of ghosts, preserved by the very agent of its destruction. Kai stopped in front of a ruined structure and gestured inside.
See this? This is a bakery. That big dome is the oven.
He pointed to the perfectly preserved brick structure.
They harnessed the mountain's geothermal heat even back then. They probably had vents piped in. They lived with it. They baked their bread with the same heat that eventually killed them.
But the Lanthians barely heard him. Their attention was fixated on the plaster casts of the victims displayed behind protective glass panels. A dog, curled and contorted. A man shielding his face with his hands. A family, huddled together in a final, futile embrace. Badru looked away. His face was pale, and a sheen of sweat coated his gray skin.
You display your dead in poses of agony? It is barbaric, a celebration of suffering.
Kai's easygoing expression hardened for a fraction of a second. It's not a trophy, Badru. It's a history lesson. It's a reminder. Rule number 1 living on Earth. Don't get cocky. Nature's always bigger than you are. He softened his tone slightly.
And rule number 2, don't build your brand new summer home villa at the foot of an active volcano.
Senna, a student whose specialization was the nascent field of xenoecology, stared at the cast of the huddled family. She looked not with horror, but with a somber scientific fascination. She saw a microecosystem brought to an instantaneous, perfect halt. They died together, she murmured, her voice soft. The mountain took them, but the fish did as one. She began to see the terrifying intimacy Kai spoke of. The relationship between a people and their violent, beautiful home. As they returned to the shuttle, Professor Olen addressed the weary group.
We will rest and recalibrate aboard the vessel during the transcontinental flight. Our next observation site is in a different hemisphere entirely. Be prepared for a significant atmospheric and thermal shift in 18 hours.
Their next stop was an ocean and a continent away, in the lush green Pacific Northwest of North America. The sensory shock here was completely different, yet just as profound. The shuttle landed in the blast zone of Mount St. Helens. When the doors opened, the Lanthians were met not with an assault of noise and smell, but with its unnerving absence. The air was shockingly crisp and thin compared to Naples. It carried the clean scent of pine and damp earth. But the silence was the most unsettling part. A deep, profound quiet seemed to press in on them. The silence of a landscape scoured clean of most life. The shuttle took them on a low-altitude flight over the blast zone. For miles in every direction, the Lanthians saw a forest of silver-gray ghosts. Tens of thousands of massive trees, stripped of their bark and branches, lay flattened on the ground. They all pointed away from the mountain's crater like a compass needle of absolute destruction. The geothermic, orderly pattern of destruction was somehow more chilling than random chaos. They landed at an observation point overlooking the massive, gaping, horseshoe-shaped crater where the mountain's peak used to be. The scale of it was difficult for their minds to comprehend. Senna, wrapped in a thermal cloak against the unexpected chill, gazed at the wounded mountain. "Professor Olin's simulation," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It showed the mountain's peak disintegrating. Was that accurate?" Kai leaned on the sturdy metal guardrail, his breath fogged in the cool air. "Oh yeah, in a big way. St. Helens lost over 1,300 feet of height in about 10 seconds. It blew it right out of the entire north face. The landslide that followed was the biggest in recorded history. It moved fast enough to break the sound barrier." He's pointed towards a distant ridge. "See that? The slide was so big that it sloshed up the side of that mountain over there like a water in a bathtub." He paused and let them absorb the sheer physics-defying violence of the event. "But the cool part, the really cool part, now we know how to listen to it. We have seismometers buried all over this thing. GPS sensors that can detect ground swelling to within a millimeter and gas sniffers that analyze what it's breathing out. We can hear its heartbeat. We can tell when it's taking a deep breath before it decides to shout again." The idea of listening to a mountain, of treating a geological feature like a living, breathing entity that could be monitored and understood, was a revelation to Senna. To the others, it was just more evidence of human insanity. Kai warmed to his subject and decided to elaborate on one of the less pleasant aspects of the eruption. "Well, the real killer, though, it wasn't the blast itself. It was the pyroclastic flow. Superheated ash, gas, and rock fragments moving at hundreds of miles an hour. It's basically a ground-hugging avalanche of incandescent death." He rubbed his hands together for warmth. Anything it touched, it would flash fry instantly. His universal translator, ever literal, did its job with chilling efficiency. "You are instantaneously subjected to lipid rendering temperatures for culinary finalization," it announced in its flat, monotone voice. Several Lanthian students gagged. One stumbled back from the railing. His face was a mask of pure horror as he imagined being rendered for a planetary-scale meal. From the cool, silent devastation of Washington State, they flew to the sweltering, vibrant life of the big island of Hawaii. The transition was another brutal sensory shock. When they disembarked, the air hit them like a physical wall. Thick, heavy, and saturated with humidity. It tasted of salt and 1,000 exotic flowers, all mixed with a faint, sharp undercurrent of sulfur. The sun was a hammer, and the black volcanic rock that made up most of the landscape radiated a palpable, visible heat. The Lanthians, already struggling with Earth's gravity, now sweated profusely inside their lightweight environmental suits, which were unprepared for this level of oppressive, damp heat. Kai led them across a vast, cooled lava flow. The ground was a jagged, uneven sea of solidified black rock, sharp and abrasive. They seemed completely at home, his boots finding easy purchase on the treacherous surface. "Yeah, you think by day 3 you get used to the weird gravity," he called back to the struggling group. "Just wait till the altitude sickness kicks in at Yellowstone." Senna pointed a trembling finger at the small crack in a black rock. A tiny, bright green shoot of a fern pushed its way up to the punishing sun. "Life," she breathed, her voice filled with a xenoecologist's wonder. "It returns even here, to this sterile substrate?" Kai grinned, a wide, genuine smile. "Returns? Senna, this is just how the whole island chain was born. new land from fire. This isn't sterile. It's brand new. Give it a few years and this whole place will be a jungle. Life on Earth didn't or doesn't just survive this stuff. It thrives on it. It's the ultimate primary succession. He paused, and he picked his way over to a different section of the flow. This is a different kind of volcano. Vesuvius and St. Helens were stratovolcanoes. They're tall, conical, explosive. This, he stamped his boot on the ground. This is a shield volcano. The lava is runnier, less gassy. It doesn't usually explode. It just flows. It just builds up the land in wide, gentle slopes. We just didn't see it as a mindless, destructive force either. We gave it a personality, a name. The goddess Pele. Fiery, passionate, destructive, creative. We made up stories to understand it, to respect it. Badru, wiping sweat from his brow, scoffed. Primitive mythology. A futile attempt to anthropomorphize a simple geological process. Maybe, Kai said, his eyes scanning the ground. Maybe it's a better way to remember that the ground you stand on is not as solid as you think. He knelt down and picked up a piece of black rock. It was different from the surrounding lava. It was smooth, glassy, and fractured into curves. Volcanic glass, he said. He held it up so it glinted in the harsh sun. Cooled so fast crystals didn't have time to form. He stood and weighed it in his hand. Our ancestors used this stuff for millennia. Arrowheads, knives, surgical tools. The edges can be sharpened to a molecular thinness, sharper than steel. To demonstrate, he pulled a self-heating ration pack from his belt. Badru watched, a condescending smirk on his face. Unstable silicon, structurally unsound. With a quick, expert flick of his wrist, Kai struck the edge of the volcanic glass against a larger rock. A razor-sharp flake split off. He held the flake between his thumb and forefinger, and with a movement too fast to follow, sliced the tough polymer of the ration pack cleanly in two. A thin line of steam hissed from the incision. The Lanthians stared, mesmerized. This beautiful, deadly death rock, as their minds categorized it, was a tool of survival forged in the planet's molten heart. They had just witnessed a human turn the raw material of planetary destruction into a kitchen knife. Their final stop was Yellowstone. The air here was thin and cold, a stark, biting contrast to Hawaii's humid embrace. The elevation made the Lanthians' already stressed respiratory systems work even harder. For the first time on the trip, Professor Olin seemed genuinely, personally awed and terrified. He stood before his class. His usual dramatic flair was replaced by a hushed, reverent fear. "Beneath our very feet," he whispered, gesturing to the steaming, geothermically active landscape around them, "lies a magma chamber approximately 90 kilometers long and 20 kilometers deep. The last major eruption, 640,000 years ago, ejected 1,000 cubic kilometers of rock and ash. That is enough to bury a continent, an event that altered the course of life on this planet." For once, Kai was quiet. He stood slightly apart from the group and looked at the bubbling mud pots and the steam that rose from the geyser basins with a genuine, deep-seated reverence. This was the big one. This was the one that even humans didn't joke about too much. Vesuvius was a tragedy. St. Helens was a disaster. Yellowstone was a potential apocalypse. Senna approached him. She pulled her cloak tight around her thin shoulders. "You are quiet," she observed. Kai nodded slowly. He kept his eyes on a distant plume of steam that rose into the crisp blue sky. "Yeah. The others? Well, they're like firecrackers. Nasty if you get too close, but localized. This..." He kicked at a loose stone on the path. "This is a planet's heartbeat. If this one goes up for real, it is a global extinction-level event. It's game over for most complex life." He glanced at the worn pack on his back.
Kinda hope we'd have time for a proper campfire later. I brought supplies for a real Terran camping experience. He offered a small, sad smile. Guess observing the potential end of the world will have to do. This quiet admission of a thwarted plan, a simple, small desire for normalcy in the face of such an incomprehensible power, hung in the air between them. It was the most vulnerable they had ever seen him. The class gathered at a designated viewing area, a safe distance away from Old Faithful. As if to reassure the terrified Lanthians that some things on this chaotic planet were predictable, the famous geyser erupted right on schedule. A magnificent plume of steam and boiling water shot hundreds of feet into the air with a deafening roar. For a moment, even the most panicked Lanthian was captivated by its raw, predictable beauty. This they could understand. A system under pressure, a regular release. It was order. The moment the eruption subsided, the world ended. Without any preamble, a cacophony of sound and sensation exploded around them. A park-wide alert system blared with a deep, resonant siren, a sound wave that vibrated in their very bones. Simultaneously, the ground beneath them lurched and shuddered with a powerful, sustained vibration generated by a network of hidden, park-wide subwoofers. Red lights atop every guidepost and building began to flash in a frantic, disorienting pattern. And from hundreds of hidden vents disguised as rocks and tree stumps, a thick, non-toxic gray particulate began to spray into the air. It billowed out in dense clouds, perfectly mimicking volcanic ash, and reduced visibility to a few feet in seconds. Through this sensory chaos, a calm, synthesized female voice began to speak over the sirens. But the first critical words were completely swallowed by the initial terrifying shock. Is a level 3 eruption drill. This is. All the Lanthian brain processed was rumbling, sirens, ash, and the final crystal clear words of the announcement. Proceed to designated evacuation zones immediately. Absolute, undiluted pandemonium erupted. The Lanthians' carefully maintained composure did not just crack, it vaporized. Their lifetimes of academic knowledge, their textbooks filled with neatly categorized disasters, proved to be a useless paper shield against primal manufactured fear. Professor Olin froze in place, his long limbs locked. His mouth opened and closed, but only fragments of textbook jargon came out. Caldera collapse, the resurgent dome instability, the end of all things, he muttered, his eyes wide and unfocused. Badru, the model student, completely broke. Pyroclastic surge! He shrieked, his voice a high-pitched, terrified squeal. Temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, velocity of 300 kilometers per hour, certain death. Having delivered his textbook-perfect diagnostic of their doom, he bolted. His long legs scissored into a tight, panicked circle. The other students were no better. They became a herd of terrified prey animals, convinced the planet itself had finally risen to devour them. They tripped over each other, their personal energy shields flickering uselessly as they collided. One student tried to climb a tree, forgot his species had no aptitude for it, and slid back down in a heap. Another simply lay on the boardwalk and curled into a fetal position. Chaos reigned. Kai watched the meltdown for a solid 3 seconds. An expression of profound, weary exasperation settled on his face. He took a deep, centering breath. The muscle memory of a dozen earthquake drills clicked into place. Miss Davidson, 3rd grade. Get low, stay calm, guide the person next to you. The rules were as ingrained as breathing. He let out a piercingly sharp whistle. It was a blade of pure sound, sharp and commanding enough to slice through the noise and panic. Everyone shut up and listen to me, he bellowed, his voice infused with the unshakable authority of every camp counselor. Fire drill captain, an exasperated older sibling in human history, cracked like a whip. The sheer force of his voice, so unlike the Lanthians' typically modulated, gentle tones, shocked them into a moment of stunned silence. Even Badru stopped his panicked pirouette. It is a drill, Kai yelled, pointing to the flashing red light. A test. See? No heat, no earthquake. It's the bad theme park ride, but we're treating it like it's real here, so move. He jabbed the commanding finger at the frozen professor. Olin, get a head count, now! Count them like you're grading papers, just don't lose anyone. The direct, simple command seemed to reboot the professor's terrified brain. Head count, yes, counting. 1, 2, he began, his voice trembling. Kai's eyes found Senna, who stared at him. Her fear was momentarily replaced by awe. Senna, you're with me. You're my lieutenant. I say it, you make sure they hear it. He did not wait for a reply. It was already in motion.
A masterclass in organized chaos management followed. Kai, operating on pure ingrained instinct honed by a childhood of disaster preparedness, became the calm, immovable center of the storm.
Stay on the ground,
he roared. He pointed along the raised wooden boardwalk that snaked through the geyser basin.
on the boardwalks. Avoid the low-lying grassy areas. That's where the real flow where Lahar would go first.
He started to move, not run, but with a purpose that pulled the others along in his wake. As he led them, his eyes scanned the terrain. He noticed the subtle glint of a camera lens disguised in a fake rock along the path. They were being observed, graded. A flicker of a competitive grin crossed his face for a second. We are not failing this test.
Cover your mouths,
he shouted over the diminishing siren.
That simuash isn't toxic, but you don't want to breathe particulate matter.
He shrugged off his pack without breaking stride, unzipped a side pocket, and pulled out a spare tunic. He ripped a long strip from it, then handed the rest to Senna.
Rip this into pieces. Get water on them.
Senna's fear was now completely replaced by focused purpose. She worked with swift efficiency. She doused the cloth with water from their flasks and began to distribute the makeshift filters to her trembling classmates. Her voice, a steady, clear echo of Kai's, translated his sharp commands into slightly more formal but equally urgent Lanthian. They moved as a cohesive, if terrified, unit. Kai was the spearhead. He physically grabbed Badru by the collar of his robe and stopped him from running blindly toward a steaming fissure that was very real.
Wrong way, genius,
he grunted, and shoved him back onto the path. He guided the now obedient group along a ridge. His voice was a constant, reassuring beacon in the manufactured apocalypse.
Keep moving. Steady pace. Don't bunch up. We're almost there.
They reached the designated safe zone, a reinforced observation bunker built discreetly into the side of a hill. Just as the drill officially concluded, the last siren wound down with a mournful groan, the ground shakers ceasing their rumbling. The ash dispensers hissed to a final stop. The Lanthian stumbled into the brightly lit bunker and collapsed, panting and trembling from the massive adrenaline dump. Inside, the air was clean and still. A large monitor on one wall displayed park schematics and a live feed of the trail that they had just navigated. The human park ranger, a woman with a weathered face, crinkly eyes, and a wide-brimmed hat, turned from a small console. A wide, friendly grin spread across her face.
At it, folks. Good hustle.
She checked the timer on her screen.
You made it 4 minutes, 3 seconds. That's a new record for an off-worlder academic group.
Kai, barely out of breath, leaned against the wall and gave her a tired thumbs up. The ranger chuckled. She looked at the heap of trembling aliens.
Y'all did much better than that Glorbian tour last year. Gelatinous species. they just dissolved into puddles of panic. You had to install a fainting couch in here just for 'em.
She patted a sturdy-looking bench near the floor. The Lanthians stared at it with newfound appreciation. As the Lanthians slowly recovered, catching their breath and checking themselves for imaginary burns and injuries, Kai's mind moved on. He wandered to the bunker's entrance. The crisp, clean air was a welcome relief. His earlier thwarted plan for a campfire gnawed at him. The desire for that small, simple act of terra normalcy was stronger than ever. His eyes scanned the area. The simuash had already begun to settle, dusting the landscape in a thin layer of gray. And then he saw it, a few dozen yards from the bunker, almost hidden behind a small outcrop of rock. There was a small, natural heat vent. It was a tiny fissure in the rock where steam and radiant heat from the magma chamber miles below created a permanent, visible shimmer in the air. A slow, mischievous, utterly human grin spread across his face. He jogged back to the shuttle, which was parked in a shielded bay nearby. He rummaged in his pack, the one that held the life-saving tunic, and returned with a large sealed bag of white puffy cylinders and a handful of telescoping metal roasting sticks. He walked over to the heat vent, extended one of the metal sticks to its full length, and impaled one of the white cylinders on its tip. The Lanthians, now emerging cautiously from the bunker, watched him in stunned, horrified silence. Kai held the marshmallow over the shimmering fissure. The radiant geothermal heat, the very breath of the supervolcano that had almost scared them to death, began to toast the confection. It swelled slightly, and then began to turn a perfect golden brown. Kai rotated it with an expert's touch and ensured an even coloration. He pulled it back, blew on it, and popped it into his mouth with a sigh of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "Perfect," he mumbled through the sticky sweetness. He turned to the silent, staring aliens and held out a roasting stick and the bag. His eyes landed on Cinna. "Want one?" Hesitantly, her scientific curiosity at war with her species' ingrained terror, she approached. She took the offered items as if they were delicate, dangerous artifacts. She carefully skewered her own marshmallow, mimicked his technique, and held it over the vent at a safe distance. She watched, fascinated, as it transformed. When it was golden, she tasted it. Her large, dark eyes went wide. A complete mixture of surprise, delight, and a profound cognitive dissonance washed over her features. Badru, now recovered enough to be indignant again, found his voice. It was shaky, but full of his old arrogance.
You're cooking your sustenance on the very breath of the planet killer? Using a geothermal anomaly as a culinary device? That is profoundly, fundamentally insane.
Kai just shrugged and already skewered another marshmallow and held out a stick to Badru. "Waste not, want not, buddy. Besides, the planet tried to kill us, so we're eating its heat. That is poetic justice." He grinned. "We call them s'mores. It's short for some more." One by one, drawn by Sina's look of quiet pleasure and Kai's utter lack of concern, a few other brave Lanthian students ventured forward. They timidly took sticks and roasted marshmallows on the edge of what they had minutes before believed to be Armageddon. The sweet, caramelizing smell of sugar mixed with the faint sulfurous scent of the earth. It created a perfume no one in the galaxy had experienced before. The flight back to the university orbital was profoundly different from the flight to Earth. The silent contemplation lived up to its name, but the silence was no longer born of fear. It was a silence of deep, contemplative awe. The Lanthian students kept glancing at Kai, who leaned against a viewport. He listened to music on his headphones and watched his homeworld shrink below. They whispered amongst themselves, their voices hushed, their entire worldview recalibrated in real time.
They have trills,
one murmured to another.
They practice for planetary extinction events, a civic exercise. Their children do it,
another added, her voice full of disbelief.
They live beside these forces every day. They build their cities on fault lines.
He said they carved blades from the mountain's blood, and that he feasted upon its fiery breath.
They were beginning to understand. Humanity didn't just survive on its death world. It hadn't just endured. It had adapted so completely, so intimately, that it had made itself at home in the jaws of the beast. Professor Olin glided silently down the aisle of the shuttle. He stopped beside Kai's seat. His posture was no longer haughty, but humbled, almost hesitant. He waited patiently for the human to notice him. Kai eventually sensed the presence and pulled off his headphones. A questioning look appeared on his face.
What's up, Professor? Olin did not look at him. He looked out at the viewport, at the swirling blue and white marble of Earth, now receding into the star-dusted blackness.
Mr. Jordan, your species' relationship with your world, it is intimate, terrifyingly so.
He turned his gaze from the planet to the student.
You spoke of listening to mountains, of giving them names, of life springing from new land born of fire. You showed us how to harness their heat, even in your ancient times.
He paused and gathered his thoughts.
I have spent my entire career studying cataclysm from the sterile safety of the simulation chamber. You have lived it. My curriculum, I see now, is woefully incomplete. It teaches the what, the mechanics of destruction, but it completely fails to grasp the how a species can face such constant existential chaos and not only endure, but...
His gaze drifted to the faint, sticky residue on Senna's fingers a few rows ahead.
Make snacks.
Olin straightened to his full, impressive height and gave Kai a short, formal bow, his head dipping low. It was a gesture of ultimate respect in Lanthian culture, reserved for sages and honored elders.
Thank you,
he said, his voice quiet but firm.
Thank you for the lesson.
A week later, Xenogeology 301 was a different class. The dramatic, fear-mongering holograms of exploding mountains were gone. In their place were complex, scientifically accurate diagrams of plate tectonics, seismic wave propagation charts, and ecological succession timelines of the Mount St. Helens blast zone. Professor Olen's lecture was no longer about the blind fury of chaotic worlds. He now spoke with genuine intellectual fervor about what he had termed the Terran paradigm, a unique evolutionary and sociological model of a species whose resilience, ingenuity, and cultural psychology were forged in constant direct oppression to their planet's geology. He spoke of humanity not as victims of a death world, but as its stubborn, resourceful, and slightly unhinged native masters. The other Lanthian students no longer looked at Kai with suspicion or fear. They looked at him with a quaint reverence, the way one might look at a historical figure who had survived a legendary ordeal. He was, to them, living proof of the Terran paradigm. Badru, seated in the front row, took furious, detailed notes on his datapad. His old textbook lay forgotten on the floor beneath his feet. After class, Senna caught up with Kai in the quiet, gleaming corridor. She held up her datapad and showed him a picture she had taken, a grainy, zoomed-in shot of him, silhouetted against the gray simu ash, calmly roasting a marshmallow over the geothermal vent.
So,
she asked, her voice soft and genuinely curious.
I kept looking at this picture. In class, that first day, we were taught this is a planetary sanguination, a world bleeding its heart out, a cosmic horror. Is that what this is? Your species making a small, defiant gesture against the ultimate monster? A beautiful, world-ending power that you must constantly appease.
Kai thought for a moment. His expression was no longer the dismissive smirk from that first lecture. It was a quiet, knowing smile, one that held the memory of hot ash in Pompeii, the silent ghosts of St. Helens, and the sweet, sticky marshmallow toasted over the heartbeat of an apocalypse. He popped a fresh piece of gum into his mouth. The sound echoed slightly in the corridor. He glanced at this new, scientifically accurate hologram of a stratovolcano now projected at the end of the hall, a teaching tool instead of a monster. His smile widened, just a bit.
Nah,
he said, his voice calm and full of earned confidence that resonated deeper than any professor's lecture.
That's just a volcano. Nah,
he said, his voice calm and full of earned confidence that resonated deeper than any professor's lecture.
That's just a volcano.